The sun was beginning to set as Tasha walked down the quiet street, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. It had been a long day at work, and all she wanted now was to grab a coffee and head home to unwind. Dressed in a sharp professional suit, her mind drifted between thoughts of paperwork, cases to be reviewed, and the weight of her responsibilities as a judge. She wasn't in any hurry. Her mind worked through the legal arguments she'd been preparing, yet there was an air of calm about her. She had learned over the years to carry herself with a quiet, unshakable confidence. People often underestimated her, but she had grown accustomed to it. As Tasha passed by a parked patrol car, a voice broke through her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am." She turned to see a police officer stepping toward her, his uniform crisp and his expression serious. The officer's tone was polite but laced with an edge of authority that immediately caught her attention. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" he said, his eyes scanning her as if looking for a reason to question her presence. Tasha's eyebrows furrowed slightly, but she remained composed. "I'm just walking, officer," she said calmly, giving him a brief, polite smile. It wasn't uncommon to be approached by the police in the area, but something about the officer's demeanor felt off. The officer didn't seem to take her answer at face value. He took a step closer, his gaze lingering a little too long on her. "You don't really seem like you belong here," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. Tasha could feel the tension in the air, the weight of his words hanging between them. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stood still, maintaining eye contact, waiting for him to clarify. His assumption was clear, and it felt as if he were sizing her up, mentally categorizing her into some preconceived box. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but with a hint of curiosity. She didn't challenge him outright, but the question was pointed. The officer hesitated, momentarily thrown off by her calmness. Then he took a step back and gave her a once-over, clearly trying to figure her out. He then pulled out a small notepad, jotting something down. "Where are you headed?" he asked, still not dropping the probing tone. Tasha didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at him, keeping her expression neutral, but there was a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She had encountered this before. The assumption, the quick judgment. "I'm just walking to grab a coffee," she said, her voice calm. There was no reason for him to question her further, and yet, he wasn't done. He glanced at her, clearly still unsure of what to make of her. "I'm going to have to ask you to wait here for a moment." The words were more forceful now, as though she needed to prove herself in some way. His stance widened, an almost unnecessary display of authority. Tasha felt a brief stir of frustration, but she suppressed it. This wasn't the time for a confrontation, not in the middle of the street, not with people watching. Instead, she nodded, her posture still relaxed, yet her mind was already working. She knew what was happening here, even if he didn't. And this time, she wasn't about to let it slide. The officer continued to write in his notebook, occasionally glancing up at her, clearly expecting her to say or do something to make this interaction more difficult. But Tasha kept quiet. Her composure only seemed to make him more uncomfortable. A few moments passed, but she didn't speak, didn't ask again why she had been stopped. She simply waited. Finally, the officer looked up at her, a faint frown on his face. "You're going to have to come with me, ma'am," he said, his tone now more authoritative, as if she had broken some unseen rule by just standing there. Tasha's eyes narrowed just slightly, but she kept her expression unreadable. "Why?" she asked, the single word hanging in the air. The officer seemed thrown off for a moment. It was clear he hadn't anticipated the question to be so simple, yet pointed. "Because I'm asking you to," he replied, his voice just a little too defensive. Tasha took a small step forward, leaning in ever so slightly as if to make her point. "You have no reason to ask me anything," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm doing nothing wrong. I'm simply walking." Her calmness only seemed to frustrate him more. The officer looked at her with a mix of disbelief and irritation, his hand going to his belt as if to make her comply. But in that moment, something shifted in the air between them, and Tasha knew it was time to reveal who she really was. The officer's hand hovered over his belt, as if preparing to escalate the situation further, but Tasha, calm and unflinching, felt the weight of the moment shift. She could see the impatience in his eyes, the judgment etched on his face, and in that instant, she decided it was time to let him know exactly who he was dealing with. With a small, almost imperceptible smile, she glanced down at the small leather notebook tucked neatly under her arm. She then pulled it out slowly, a deliberate gesture that caught the officer's attention. "Before you take further action," she said in a soft, almost detached tone, "I think you should know who I am." The officer blinked, clearly confused by the sudden shift in her demeanor. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice a bit more guarded now, sensing that something was off. Tasha didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took her time, flipping the notebook open to a page where a small card was tucked inside. She pulled it out and held it up for him to see, her calm gaze never wavering from his face. The officer's eyes flicked to the card, then back to her, and for a brief second, he looked genuinely uncertain. The card was simple, just a name, a title, and a symbol that the officer didn't immediately recognize. But it was enough. "I'm Judge Tasha Morgan," she said quietly, her voice now carrying the weight of her position, though she spoke it without arrogance. The words hung in the air like a quiet thunderclap, and for a moment the world seemed to slow down. The officer stared at the card, then back at her, his expression shifting from one of authority to one of confusion, then disbelief. The air between them felt charged with tension. "Judge?" he repeated, the word seeming foreign on his lips, as if it didn't quite fit with the image he had built in his mind of who she was. "Yes," she confirmed, her smile still subtle but now carrying a layer of quiet power. "And you're mistaken if you think I don't belong here. In fact, I'm well within my rights to be on this street, walking to grab my coffee without being harassed." The officer's hand slowly dropped from his belt, and his posture faltered for the first time. For a moment he stood there, speechless, as the realization hit him. His eyes darted between the card and Tasha's composed face, trying to reconcile the confident, calm woman standing before him with the assumptions he had made just moments ago. She could see his mind racing, his earlier bravado cracking under the weight of the truth. And in that brief silence, she felt a flicker of something. Satisfaction, maybe, but not in a vengeful way. No, this wasn't about retribution. This was about ensuring that no one ever underestimated her again. The officer cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable now. He took a small step back, his face flushing with the beginnings of embarrassment. I didn't know," he muttered, his words almost too soft to hear. The weight of the moment didn't quite hit him until it was too late, and by then it was clear that his assumptions had already led him to make a critical error. But Tasha wasn't interested in his apology. She wasn't here to make him feel guilty or to drag him through the mud. She was here to make a point. "No," Tasha replied, her voice cool and measured. "You didn't. And that's the problem." She let the words settle between them, her eyes never leaving his. The officer opened his mouth as if to say something more, but the words seemed to fail him. His authority, once so certain, now felt small and hollow in the face of his mistake. The officer shifted uneasily on his feet, glancing around as if searching for some sort of escape from the situation. He couldn't seem to find the right words to address the reality of what had just unfolded. His arrogance was quickly replaced by an awkward silence, one that hung in the air like an uncomfortable weight. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then cleared his throat as though trying to regain his composure. Tasha watched him with quiet patience, giving him the space to process. She didn't feel the need to fill the silence. Her calm presence was enough to make him realize that the situation was no longer in his control. She didn't need to raise her voice or make an aggressive gesture. It was enough to stand there, steady, unmoving, as he floundered in the face of his own mistake. Finally, he spoke, his tone softer than it had been before, though still laced with a hint of defensiveness. "I'm sorry," he muttered, though the apology lacked sincerity, as if he was simply trying to diffuse the tension, rather than truly acknowledging the gravity of his actions. "I didn't mean to. I thought you were just another person." His words trailed off, and he avoided her gaze, looking down at his boots as if hoping the ground would swallow him up. Tasha nodded slightly, her face unreadable. "You assumed," she said, her voice steady. "You assumed that because of how I look, where I was, and probably because of the color of my skin, that I didn't belong here." Her words were measured, each one hitting its mark. The officer flinched at the truth. His face turning a shade darker, she could see the realization dawning on him. It wasn't just about the minor inconvenience of being stopped. No, this was about something much deeper. Something that spoke to his biases. Something that reflected a systemic issue he wasn't prepared to confront. "You see, officer," Tasha continued, her tone unwavering, "you didn't see me as a judge because that didn't fit the image in your mind of who I should be." She could see the officer shift, his posture now visibly tense, as though he were bracing himself for something he wasn't ready for. The silence stretched on, heavier now. He didn't speak, didn't try to defend himself further, and Tasha didn't push him to. Instead, she took a small step back, allowing him the time and space to understand the magnitude of the encounter. She knew it was a rare moment for him, a moment where he was forced to reckon with the prejudice that had governed his actions up until now. After what seemed like an eternity, the officer finally looked up at her, and Tasha saw the mix of embarrassment and uncertainty in his eyes. His shoulders slumped slightly as he took a step back, trying to distance himself from the situation. "I'll let you go," he muttered, the words sounding almost like a surrender, as though he were too ashamed to continue with the harassment. "But please, I'll get a report on this." Tasha didn't react to his offer to make a report. There was no need to waste her energy on it. "You don't need to do anything," she replied, her voice calm but final. "Just remember that next time you stop someone, it might be a good idea to look a little closer before you judge." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of someone who had seen and endured this kind of treatment far too many times. The officer didn't respond. He simply turned, walking back to his patrol car without another word. Tasha stood there for a moment, watching him go, feeling the familiar sense of injustice settle in her chest. But she didn't let it linger. She had made her point. She had shown him who she was, not by shouting or demanding respect, but by simply standing her ground. She turned and continued her walk down the street, the weight of the day's events already starting to fade. As she walked, she couldn't help but think about how many others had been in her position. How many others had been underestimated, harassed, or treated unfairly because of who they were. But now, she had made a small difference. Maybe it was just one officer, but in that brief exchange, she had cracked open a small window of understanding, and maybe, just maybe, it would change him for good. Tasha continued down the street, the evening air cooling as she walked past the quiet storefronts and residential homes. Her thoughts were already moving on to the next item on her mental checklist. There would be paperwork waiting for her when she got home, phone calls to return, and perhaps a few more legal arguments to consider for the upcoming cases. But her mind kept drifting back to the brief encounter she'd just had with the officer. It wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who didn't have the means or the power to stand their ground, to calmly assert their rights in the face of ignorance and prejudice. For her, the situation had been a brief interruption, a reminder of the battles she fought daily, not just in the courtroom, but in the world at large. Still, she felt a sense of relief that she had been able to make a point without escalating things further. She hadn't raised her voice or threatened the officer. She had simply shown him that respect isn't something you can assume based on skin color, appearance, or preconceived notions. As she turned the corner to her street, the thought lingered. What would have happened if she had been anyone else? Would the officer have treated her with the same respect if she hadn't been able to reveal her identity? Would he have continued to assume she was someone to be controlled, rather than someone who belonged? These were the kinds of questions that stayed with her, even long after the incident had ended. Just as she approached her apartment building, her phone buzzed. Tasha pulled it out of her purse and glanced at the screen. It was a message from her assistant. "Judge Morgan, there's a call waiting for you at the office. It's urgent. They said it's about a situation involving a police officer." Tasha stopped in her tracks. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to read the message again to know that it was likely related to the encounter she had just experienced. She stood for a moment, considering whether she should call back immediately. It was late, and she was exhausted from the long day. But something about the message made her uneasy. It wasn't just about the officer anymore. What if this was bigger than her personal encounter? What if someone else had witnessed it? What if this was the start of something much more complicated than a simple misunderstanding? Tasha quickly dialed the office number and waited as the phone rang. Her mind raced through possibilities, trying to piece together what could be unfolding on the other side of the call. The line clicked, and her assistant's voice came through, sounding unusually serious. "Judge Morgan, the situation has escalated," her assistant said, the urgency in her tone clear. "The police officer you encountered earlier, Officer Wells, he's been questioned by his superior. There's been a report filed, and now they're looking into the incident." Tasha's mind immediately went to the officer she had spoken to earlier. She wasn't surprised that a report had been filed. After all, it wasn't every day that a police officer was confronted by someone of her position in such a way. But the idea that this was now officially under investigation made her pause. "What kind of report?" she asked, her voice calm but with a hint of concern creeping in. "What's the nature of it?" "They're saying the officer may have acted improperly," the assistant replied. "But they also want to know why he was questioned by someone with your stature." Tasha's stomach sank. She wasn't sure what the officer had said in his report, but she had a sinking feeling that her identity might now be the center of the scrutiny. Had she made a mistake by revealing it so quickly? Was she about to be pulled into a larger investigation that would only complicate things further? She couldn't help but feel a wave of uncertainty wash over her, though she pushed it down. "I'll be there first thing in the morning," she said, trying to steady her thoughts. "Have them gather the details and let me know if anything else comes up tonight." She ended the call and stood for a moment in front of her building, looking up at the lights in the windows. Tasha took a deep breath. The last thing she wanted was for her name to be involved in anything that wasn't strictly professional. She'd only wanted to make a simple point to that officer, to show him that no one should ever be judged simply by the color of their skin. But now it seemed the matter was taking on a life of its own. She walked up the steps to her apartment, her mind already shifting back to the task at hand. The next few hours might be unpredictable, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't let this go. She had made her stand. Now it was time to make sure that stand was understood, both by the officer and by the system that allowed such things to happen in the first place. Tasha spent the next hour pacing her apartment, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. The weight of the situation was heavier than she had anticipated. It was one thing to stand her ground in front of a single officer, but now that it had escalated, she couldn't help but wonder if she had inadvertently opened a door to more complications than she was ready to deal with. Still, she couldn't regret what had happened. What she had done was necessary. Her calm demeanor had been enough to expose the officer's biases, but she hadn't expected it to snowball like this. She pulled a glass of water from the kitchen and sat at her desk, glancing at the stack of legal files that needed her attention. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her colleague, who had heard about the incident from a mutual acquaintance. "Heard about what happened today. Are you okay? Anything you need?" it read. Tasha smiled faintly at the concern, but this wasn't the time to lean on others for support. She had to handle this herself. She typed a quick reply: "I'm fine, just dealing with some fallout. I'll keep you updated." The phone buzzed again almost immediately. This time, it was her assistant, who sent a simple text: "The police are requesting a meeting for tomorrow morning. They want to speak with you directly about the incident." Tasha set the phone down and ran a hand through her hair. She had known this was coming. The officer, Officer Wells, would likely have to explain his actions, and the department would want to hear her side of the story as well. The question was, how would they handle it? Would they try to sweep it under the rug, or would this be the first step in forcing a real change within the department? She didn't have the answers yet, but she knew that her next move had to be calculated. With a deep breath, she got up and walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. The streetlights flickered softly, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. This was the calm before the storm, and she could feel it in the pit of her stomach. She wasn't just being asked to address an isolated incident anymore. She was being drawn into something bigger than herself. A conversation about bias, power, and accountability in places where those in authority often went unchecked. She thought back to the officer's face, his surprise when she revealed who she was. The disbelief in his eyes hadn't been just about her position. It had been about his own failure to see beyond his assumptions. He had assumed that someone like her, a Black woman walking alone on a quiet street, didn't belong, and he had acted on that assumption, putting both of them in a situation that had quickly escalated. But what happened next? What was going to come from this? She was about to find out. She glanced at the clock. It was getting late. There wasn't much she could do tonight except prepare herself for the meeting tomorrow. She needed to focus, to stay grounded. The last thing she needed was to make this personal. She had to remain the professional she had always been, especially now that this had the potential to change not only her life, but also the lives of many others who face similar prejudices every day. Tasha went to her closet and grabbed her blazer, laying it out on the bed. She was determined not to show any sign of weakness tomorrow. She had to walk into that room not just as a judge, but as someone who had seen firsthand the consequences of unchecked power. And if there was one thing she knew, it was that the system could change, one person at a time. And maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to be that change. With a quiet resolve, she picked up her phone again, sent a quick message to her assistant, and began reviewing the details of the meeting. Tomorrow would be a new challenge, but she was ready. The next morning arrived with a sense of urgency that Tasha had grown used to over the years. But today, there was a palpable tension in the air. She dressed carefully, choosing a dark suit that made her feel powerful but not overbearing. It was the kind of attire that conveyed authority without demanding it. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she adjusted her blazer, smoothing down the fabric with deliberate precision. The weight of the day ahead rested heavy on her shoulders, but she remained composed. By the time she left her apartment, the streets were already bustling with the rhythm of the city, commuters rushing to work, cars honking as they navigated traffic, people going about their business. But for Tasha, everything felt distant. She could feel the eyes of the world, or at least her own mind, watching her. It wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was about what the officer represented. A system of bias, a culture of assumptions made based on the color of one's skin. A structure that allowed such mistakes to go unchecked until they reached a boiling point. Tasha arrived at the police station just before her scheduled meeting. The building loomed large in front of her, a cold, imposing structure. She walked through the front doors with steady steps, her heels clicking on the tile floor, each sound a reminder of her purpose. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of formal seriousness and hurried routine. Officers moved about, some chatting with each other, others in deep conversation, but there was no mistaking the fact that today, there was an added layer of tension in the air. Tasha knew that the room she was walking into wasn't just a typical meeting. It was the beginning of something bigger. As she was led to the conference room, her assistant's voice echoed in her mind. "Remember, Judge Morgan, this isn't about you. It's about setting a precedent." Those words rang true, but Tasha couldn't help but feel the weight of being the one to carry this burden. The officer, Officer Wells, had no idea what he had set in motion, but Tasha was determined to make sure that this moment counted. The room was sterile, furnished with a large table and a few chairs. She took a seat at one end, facing the door, her posture straight and unyielding. The officers involved in the investigation would soon arrive, along with any witnesses or others who might have information on the incident. But in the silence that followed, she sat alone for a few moments, gathering her thoughts. It was always like this before a big decision, quiet, almost too still. But this time, she wasn't preparing for a case in a courtroom. She was preparing to fight something far more insidious, the systemic issue of racial bias within an institution that was supposed to uphold justice. As she glanced around the room, she noticed the absence of the officer who had been involved. Her gut told her that his absence meant more than just scheduling. Maybe he had been warned. Maybe he wasn't even sure how to face her after what had happened. Tasha wasn't sure if he felt guilt or fear, but one thing was certain. He had no idea the kind of change he had just triggered. Minutes later, the door opened, and several figures walked in. The officer, Officer Wells, was among them, his face tight with anxiety. He walked to the far end of the room, taking a seat in a chair across from her, his hands visibly trembling. His demeanor had completely shifted from the arrogant, dismissive officer she had encountered on the street. Now, he was clearly on the defensive, unsure of himself. There were others in the room too, senior officers and a few internal investigators, all there to look into what had transpired. The senior officer who led the meeting stepped forward, offering a formal greeting. "Judge Morgan," he said, his voice polite but tinged with a formality that suggested this wasn't just another routine meeting. "Thank you for joining us this morning. We'd like to hear your side of the story regarding your interaction with Officer Wells yesterday." Tasha nodded, her expression calm but focused. Of course, she said, her voice clear. I've been asked here to provide clarity about the incident. But I also want to make one thing clear. This isn't just about me. It's about the system that allowed this to happen. The officer, Wells, shifted in his seat. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but the senior officer quickly silenced him with a raised hand, allowing Tasha to continue. She could feel the tension building, but she wasn't about to back down now. As I was walking down the street yesterday, she began, her voice measured. I was stopped by Officer Wells. He questioned my presence, assumed that I didn't belong there, and escalated the situation without any cause. When I revealed who I was, he was shocked, and rightly so. But that moment shouldn't have been a revelation. The assumption that someone like me, a black woman, didn't belong there. That is the real issue here. That is what needs to be addressed. There was a pause in the room, and she could see the subtle shift in the faces around the table. Officer Wells was now visibly uncomfortable. His hands were clasped tightly together, and his head was lowered, as if trying to avoid her gaze. Tasha could feel his discomfort, but she wasn't there to offer him comfort. She was there to make sure this was the last time an officer would be allowed to act on assumptions like that, without facing real consequences. The senior officer cleared his throat. We are committed to understanding what happened here and ensuring that such incidents do not happen again. But we need to hear from you, Officer Wells. Your version of events is critical. Tasha glanced at the officer, her expression neutral but firm. She could see him struggle internally, his mind working through the words he was about to say. And though she didn't speak it aloud, she knew he was facing the consequences of his own actions, and he wasn't sure how to explain himself now that he had been forced to confront the truth. The room waited. Officer Wells shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. His once assured posture had collapsed, replaced with the uneasy, almost defeated body language of someone caught in their own misjudgment. The room grew quiet, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. He looked up at Tasha, but quickly looked away, his gaze focusing on the table as if the answers were hidden there. Well, Officer Wells started, his voice strained. I didn't mean to escalate things like that. It was just, you were walking there alone, and I assumed you were out of place. I've stopped people before who looked like they were maybe not supposed to be in the area. He trailed off, his words stumbling over each other as if he were struggling to put the right sentences together. Tasha's gaze remained steady, unwavering, but her mind was working. She had heard this before, the flimsy excuses, the half-hearted justifications. She had heard it from people in positions of power who thought their biases didn't matter, that their assumptions could be excused. She could feel the tension in the room rise, but she didn't allow it to distract her. She wasn't here for his apology or his half-baked reasons. She was here for accountability. I see, she said, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of something stronger. You assumed because I was a black woman walking alone that I didn't belong. And when you saw I didn't conform to your idea of who should be in that area, you decided to take action. Did you consider that maybe I just didn't fit your stereotype of who should be walking there? She let her words sink in. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Officer Wells shifted in his seat, his eyes darting nervously between Tasha and the other officers in the room. He opened his mouth to say something, but closed it again, clearly realizing the weight of the words he had just spoken. Officer Wells, the senior officer said, his voice stern, do you understand how serious this is? The fact that you made assumptions based on someone's appearance, without any reason, without any proof of wrongdoing, is a clear violation of our duty as law enforcement. Your actions put this woman in an uncomfortable position, and now we have to answer for that. Tasha could feel the weight of the senior officer's words, but she wasn't ready to let the conversation end there. She leaned forward slightly, looking directly at Wells. I don't think you realize the full scope of what happened yesterday, she said, her tone still measured but sharp. What you did wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of how deep these biases go, how we assume people don't belong in certain spaces because of how they look. And those assumptions, those mistakes, have consequences. You don't get to hide behind the badge and assume that your actions won't be questioned anymore. Wells opened his mouth to speak again but hesitated, as if struggling with the words. I didn't mean. His voice trailed off, and he lowered his gaze again. Tasha looked at him for a moment, then shifted her attention to the senior officer. This isn't about me or Officer Wells anymore. It's about the larger issue here. We can't keep pretending that these biases don't exist within the system. You asked me to come here, and I'm telling you, this has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed now. The senior officer nodded slowly, his expression still serious. We will investigate this further, Judge Morgan. We will take this matter to the department's review board and ensure proper action is taken. Tasha remained silent, waiting for more, but she knew that this moment was just one step in a larger process. She wasn't going to get immediate results, but she had made her point clear. Officer Wells would have to face the consequences of his actions. She didn't know what the final outcome would be, but she knew this. This would not be ignored. The meeting room was thick with an uncomfortable silence after Tasha's last statement. Officer Wells, now visibly shaken, stared at the table in front of him, the weight of his own actions hanging heavy in the air. The senior officer, who had previously taken charge, glanced at the other officers in the room, his eyes flickering with a hint of frustration. It was clear that this wasn't going according to the typical routine, and it was starting to unravel in ways they hadn't expected. Thank you, Judge Morgan, the senior officer said, his voice now somewhat resigned. We will handle this internally. You have made your point, and we will take steps to ensure this doesn't happen again. Tasha didn't respond immediately. She let the room breathe for a moment, letting the gravity of the situation settle in. It wasn't just about Officer Wells anymore. It was about the larger issue at hand. The biases, the assumptions, the systemic nature of discrimination in places where it was least expected. This wasn't going to be fixed with a simple apology or an internal investigation. This was about a culture that needed to change. I appreciate your commitment to address this, Tasha said after a moment, her voice firm but calm. But words aren't enough. We need action, real action. Bias training isn't just a checkbox to tick off. It's something that has to be lived day in and day out. It has to become part of the culture of this department. If you're serious about making real change, that's where it starts. The senior officer nodded slowly, his face a mixture of understanding and reluctance. We'll consider your suggestions, Judge Morgan. I'll ensure the board is informed and that a more comprehensive review is conducted. Tasha stood up, adjusting her blazer and gathering her things. I'll be expecting results, she said quietly before turning toward the door. The officers in the room watched her leave, some with expressions of respect, others with discomfort. Tasha didn't care about their discomfort. She cared about making sure this didn't happen again, making sure that the next person who walked down that same street wouldn't face the same treatment. As the door clicked shut behind her, she let out a long breath. This was just the beginning. She knew there was more to come, but for now, she had done what she needed to do. Now, it was up to the system to respond. The day moved on in a blur for Tasha. She hadn't expected the meeting to be easy, but she also hadn't expected the weight of it to linger this long. As she left the police station and walked back to her car, she felt a quiet but persistent sense of resolve settling over her. There had been no immediate resolution, no drastic shift in the room that day, but she knew the seed had been planted. The conversation had been forced. The next steps would be critical. The officer's apology, weak as it was, had been a small victory, but the bigger one was the acknowledgement from the senior officer that action would follow. But Tasha knew that wasn't enough. She had made it clear that the work wasn't over. The department couldn't just pay lip service to the issue of racial bias. It needed to be ingrained into every interaction, every decision. She couldn't afford to let this moment slip away into a forgotten file. By the time she got home, the evening was already upon her, but her mind wouldn't let go of the meeting. She sat down at her kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of tea, her thoughts replaying the conversation over and over again. The officer's discomfort, the senior officer's reluctant promises. They had all left their mark, but it was the underlying frustration that gnawed at her. This wasn't just about a single incident or a single officer. It was about a system that had allowed the idea of racial profiling to take root and continue unchecked. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. She picked it up and saw that it was her assistant, with an update from the meeting. Judge Morgan, the department is moving forward with the review. The training schedule is being revisited, and they're discussing how to improve internal accountability moving forward. They'll be in touch with more details soon. Tasha set the phone down, a mix of cautious optimism and skepticism settling in. She had heard these promises before, but this time felt different. This time, it was her voice that had made a difference. It wasn't just about a few biased actions from an officer. It was about the idea that systemic change could start with one person, one conversation, one action. She took another sip of her tea and leaned back in her chair, letting the silence in her apartment wrap around her. She knew the work wasn't done, and this would not be the last time she would have to stand up to biases that were too often brushed aside. But for the first time in a long while, Tasha felt a glimmer of hope. Change was slow, but it was possible. And if today had proven anything, it was that even small steps could eventually lead to something much bigger. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and legal documents. Tasha's schedule was packed, but the events from the police station continued to linger in the back of her mind. She wasn't naive enough to think that one conversation had changed everything, but the ripples of that conversation were beginning to spread in ways she hadn't expected. She was sitting at her desk late one afternoon when her assistant walked in, holding a thick folder in her hand. "Judge Morgan, the department has completed their preliminary review," she said, placing the folder down in front of Tasha. "They've come up with a plan, and it's actually more comprehensive than we thought." Tasha looked at the folder, her curiosity piqued. She had been expecting something vague, some half-hearted attempt at addressing the issue. But as she flipped open the folder, she saw that this wasn't the case. The department had outlined a detailed action plan, focusing on new policies for bias training, a clearer reporting structure for officers involved in misconduct, and a long-term strategy to integrate cultural competency into their hiring practices. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The plan included immediate changes, mandatory bias and cultural competency training for all officers within the next 6 months, a reevaluation of the department's recruitment process to ensure more diversity within the ranks, and an emphasis on de-escalation techniques. There were also provisions for creating a community feedback loop, a way for civilians to report concerns without fear of retaliation, and for officers to be held accountable for their actions. Tasha looked up from the folder, meeting her assistant's gaze. "This is more than I expected," she said, her voice soft but with a note of surprise. "It's not enough yet, but it's a good first step. It's a start." Her assistant smiled slightly, though the expression was tinged with the same caution Tasha felt. "It's not going to be easy, Judge. You know that. But they've committed to following through with the changes." Tasha nodded, closing the folder and setting it aside. "I'm not done yet," she said, her tone resolute. "This is just the beginning. We have to make sure they stay true to their word. I'll be following up with them regularly. We can't afford to let this slip through the cracks." Her assistant nodded in agreement, and the two of them fell into a comfortable silence for a moment. The world outside her office was still spinning, and while she had managed to make an impact, Tasha knew this fight was far from over. It would take more than just policies to change hearts and minds. It would take time, persistence, and more voices than just her own. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond the walls of the courtroom. There was real work to be done, and Tasha was ready to keep pushing until the changes she'd started to see took root and began to grow. Over the next few weeks, Tasha made it her mission to stay on top of the progress being made by the police department. She checked in regularly, meeting with various officers and city officials to ensure the promised changes were being implemented. The follow-up meetings were always professional, but each one left Tasha with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The department was moving forward, albeit slowly, and the leadership was clearly trying to meet the benchmarks they had set. But Tasha knew that lasting change wasn't going to happen overnight, and it wouldn't be achieved through policies alone. She had seen too many instances where reforms were passed, but failed to truly take hold. It was the culture that needed to shift, not just the rules. That was what she had been pushing for all along, an understanding that change had to be both systemic and personal. One afternoon, as Tasha sat in her office reviewing case files, Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from her assistant. There's a community meeting tonight. They're discussing the progress of the police reform initiatives, and the department's leadership is going to be there. It's an open forum. You should attend. Tasha felt a rush of anticipation. This wasn't just about the department anymore. It was about the people. The community had a stake in these changes, and their voices were just as critical as the decisions made behind closed doors. She quickly made up her mind. She would attend. Not as a judge, but as a member of the community who had seen firsthand how the system could go wrong. It was time for her to hear from those who had been affected the most. That evening, she arrived at the community center, a modest building in the heart of the neighborhood. Inside, the room was filled with people from all walks of life. Local residents, activists, and even a few police officers. There was a palpable sense of urgency in the air. People were tired, frustrated, but also hopeful. Tasha took a seat near the front, her presence not one of authority, but of solidarity. She didn't need to speak at first. She needed to listen. The meeting began, and voices rang out from every corner of the room. Some were hopeful, speaking of the progress they had seen, while others expressed deep skepticism. "We've been promised change before," one resident said, shaking his head. "But nothing ever really changes. We need more than words. We need action. We need to feel safe in our own neighborhoods." Tasha listened carefully, her heart heavy as the stories of racial profiling, police harassment, and systemic injustice were shared. It wasn't just the incident she had experienced with Officer Wells. It was a pattern that had affected entire communities for decades. The pain, the fear, and the anger in the room were palpable, and Tasha felt it all. She could feel the eyes of the community on her, some with hope, some with doubt. When the floor opened up for comments, Tasha stood, her voice steady as she addressed the room. "I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of assumptions," she said, her words calm but firm. "I've experienced it myself. But I'm also here because I believe in the possibility of real change. I've seen the police department's efforts to address these issues, and I'm holding them accountable. But this is not something that can be done without the community's support. We are in this together, and we must continue to push for the changes we deserve. I will continue to fight for you, for all of us. But we need each other to make sure this change is lasting." The room fell silent for a moment, and then the applause began. It wasn't loud or raucous, but it was genuine. Tasha could feel the weight of the moment settle into her chest. This wasn't just about a police officer making a mistake. It was about the whole system working together to rebuild trust. And tonight, she realized, was just another step in that long journey. The following weeks were filled with both progress and setbacks. The department had rolled out the first of its mandatory bias training sessions, and while there was a sense of commitment, Tasha knew that this was only the beginning. The real challenge would be changing the attitudes that had been ingrained over years, even decades. But there were glimmers of hope, small victories that began to add up. One afternoon, Tasha received an unexpected call. It was from Officer Wells, the very same officer who had harassed her weeks earlier. He was asking for a meeting. At first, she hesitated. The officer had made his apology during their initial meeting, but this felt different. He had been uncomfortable, yes, but had he truly learned anything? Or was this another attempt to explain away his actions? Tasha thought about it for a moment before agreeing to meet him. She needed to understand if this moment had really shifted him, or if he was simply following protocol to save face. She agreed to meet him at a local coffee shop, a neutral ground where they could have an honest conversation. When she arrived, Wells was already sitting at a table, his hands folded nervously in front of him. He stood up as she approached, his face a little flushed. "Thank you for meeting me, Judge Morgan," he said, his voice still tinged with the awkwardness she had remembered from their first encounter. Tasha nodded, taking a seat across from him. "What's on your mind, Officer Wells?" He hesitated before speaking. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since that day. I wanted to call and apologize again, but I also wanted to ask you something." He paused, as though gathering his thoughts. "I've realized that what I did was wrong. I acted on assumptions, and I didn't treat you with the respect you deserve. But I guess I want to know, how do I make it right? How do I make sure I don't make that mistake again?" Tasha listened carefully, watching him as he spoke. His words weren't rehearsed. There was no defensiveness in his tone, no excuses. It was the first time he had taken full responsibility. It was clear he was struggling, but there was sincerity there. "You've already made the first step, Officer Wells," she said softly. "You've acknowledged the mistake. Now, you have to show up every day and make sure you don't fall into those old patterns. It's not just about what you say. It's about how you act. You have to earn the trust back, not just of people like me, but of the community you serve." Wells nodded slowly, his face serious. "I understand. I want to do better." Tasha smiled faintly, a small gesture of encouragement. It's a long road, but it's one worth taking. She could see that he wasn't quite there yet, but there was potential for growth. And that, she realized, was all she could ask for, a genuine willingness to change. Over the next few months, Tasha continued to monitor the progress of the police reform initiatives closely. There were ups and downs, of course. Some officers resisted the new policies, while others embraced them wholeheartedly. But Tasha could see the gradual shift in attitudes, even if it was slow and imperfect. Small victories kept her motivated, a more thoughtful approach in how officers handled situations on the street, less overt discrimination, and even a few community outreach programs aimed at rebuilding the fractured trust between the police and the people they were supposed to protect. It wasn't easy. Change never was. There were still incidents that made her angry, still moments when the biases she had worked so hard to challenge reared their ugly heads. But each time, she held on to the progress, no matter how small. This fight wasn't something she could win overnight, but each day was a step forward. And that's how real change was made, through persistence and a refusal to back down. Then one day, while Tasha was reviewing her cases, she received another unexpected call. This time, it was Officer Wells, who had reached out again, asking to meet. Tasha's first instinct was to be cautious. They had spoken before, but the question still lingered. Had he truly changed? Or was this another round of apologies and empty promises? Yet there was something about his request that made her pause. He wasn't avoiding her like some officers had. He was seeking her out, willing to be held accountable. Curious, she agreed to meet with him. They arranged to meet at the same coffee shop where they'd spoken before. When she arrived, Officer Wells was already sitting at the same table, his posture less stiff this time. He looked up as she approached, offering a hesitant but sincere smile. "Judge Morgan," he said, standing up as she sat down. "Thanks for meeting with me again." Tasha nodded. "Of course. What's on your mind, Officer Wells?" He hesitated, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "I've been reflecting a lot. Since that first meeting with you, I've been trying to put the training and the feedback we've gotten into practice. It hasn't been easy. I've made mistakes, but I've also been trying harder to listen, to see people for who they really are instead of making assumptions." Tasha studied him for a moment. There was something different in his tone this time. It wasn't just an apology. It was an acknowledgement of his own growth, albeit a slow one. "I wanted to tell you something, Judge Morgan," he continued. "I've been working closely with some of the younger officers, guiding them through these new training programs. I realized that what I did to you, that assumption, it's what too many of us have done to people for far too long. I want to help change that if I can." Tasha's expression softened. She could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just saying the right words. He genuinely understood now. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, but he was offering change, not just in his own actions, but in the way he was teaching others. "That's a good step," she said, her voice steady. "But remember, change isn't just about teaching others what you've learned. It's about living it every day, in every interaction. You'll have to keep showing up, making it a part of everything you do." Wells nodded, his face a little less tense. "I know, and I will. I want to do better." Tasha could see that he wasn't asking for her approval, but for validation of the journey he had started. And in that moment, she felt a small flicker of hope. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about the impact he could have on others, the ripple effect that could start from someone finally realizing the gravity of their actions. Tasha smiled slightly. "Then keep going. Don't stop now." The next few months brought even more changes, both big and small. The department's ongoing reform efforts continued, but Tasha could see that something else was starting to shift. The community's trust, once fractured, was beginning to rebuild. People were more willing to speak out, more willing to engage with the police, not because everything was perfect, but because they saw real effort being made. They saw officers like Wells trying to make a difference. Tasha, too, continued her work in the courtroom, but she found herself more deeply invested in the reform efforts outside of it. She attended more community meetings, spoke at town halls, and even worked with local organizations to create outreach programs that encouraged dialogue between citizens and law enforcement. She knew that the work wasn't done, but there was a growing sense of momentum, a belief that change was possible, and it was worth fighting for. One day, as Tasha was walking to her car after a particularly long day at the courthouse, she noticed a group of people standing in front of a local community center. They were holding signs, speaking passionately, and Tasha felt an urge to walk over and listen. As she got closer, she realized they were discussing a new initiative, one that focused on restorative justice and how it could be applied to cases of police misconduct. The crowd was diverse: Black, white, Latino, young, and old. And they were talking with a passion that reminded her of the earlier days when she had stood up to Officer Wells. The power of the community, the power of their voices, was undeniable. Tasha joined the group, listening intently as they shared their stories. Some spoke about the mistrust they had faced from law enforcement. Others talked about their efforts to bridge that gap, to create a better system for everyone. One of the speakers, a woman who had been active in the local activism community, noticed Tasha standing at the back. "Judge Morgan," she said, her voice warm. "We've been hearing about the changes you've been working on. Thank you for being a part of this. It means everything to us." Tasha smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I'm just one person," she said, her voice calm but filled with conviction. "But I believe in the power of all of us working together. The system can change, but it will take every one of us to make it happen." As she left the gathering later that evening, Tasha felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about one incident or one officer. It was about all of them, about each step taken, no matter how small, in the right direction. There would be setbacks, yes. There would always be more work to do. But for the first time in a long while, she felt that the fight was worth it. Real change, slow as it was finally starting to take root, and Tasha knew she would continue to be a part of it, every step of the way. The following year proved to be a turning point in Tasha's journey. The police department's efforts toward reform were met with mixed reactions, as expected. But the community's engagement had reached new heights. The partnership between the community and law enforcement, though still fragile, was slowly starting to feel like something real, something lasting. Tasha remained involved, speaking at forums and offering her support whenever needed. But she also began to see a shift in the way people interacted with each other. There were more collaborations, more outreach programs, and most importantly, a growing understanding that it wasn't just the police who had to change. It was the system, the laws, the very structure of the community's relationship with authority. But as much as the progress encouraged her, Tasha knew there was still work to be done. The police department had made strides in policy and community engagement, but there were still those who resisted. Officers who struggled to see beyond their biases, activists who doubted that real change could ever be achieved within the system. And then there were the citizens, many of whom still couldn't trust the department no matter how many reforms were passed. It was going to take time, Tasha knew that. Real change had to be built brick by brick, relationship by relationship. One evening, as she sat in her office reviewing case files, her phone buzzed with a new notification. It was from Officer Wells. After their last meeting months ago, they hadn't kept in touch much, but this time, Wells was reaching out again, asking to meet. Tasha hesitated, wondering what this meeting would bring, but she agreed. When she walked into the coffee shop, she noticed him sitting at the same table, the one where they had met before. He looked different now, more confident, perhaps a little older, a little wiser. When he saw her, he stood up, his expression a mixture of respect and something deeper. "Judge Morgan," he greeted her, his voice warm but serious. "Thanks for meeting me again." Tasha smiled slightly. "Of course. What's on your mind, Officer Wells?" "I wanted to tell you that things have changed for me," he said, sitting down. "I've been working closely with new recruits, guiding them through the training we've implemented. I don't just talk to them about what happened with you, but about the bigger picture, about how we, as officers, have a duty to protect and serve everyone, regardless of who they are, where they come from, or what they look like. Tasha listened carefully. She had heard this before, people talking about change, but this time, there was something different in his tone. He wasn't speaking about what he had been told to do. He was speaking from his own experience, from what he had learned, and from the work he was actively putting in to make sure he didn't repeat his mistakes. I'm not saying I've got it all figured out, Wells continued, but I'm trying to be better every day. And I know there are others like me, trying to learn and unlearn their biases. And that's what gives me hope. I wanted to thank you again, Judge. You were right. We have to keep pushing, keep showing up, and keep being accountable, every day. Tasha felt a sense of gratitude swell within her, mixed with cautious optimism. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And in a world that often moved too fast for true change to take hold, progress was enough for now. The summer passed, and the momentum continued to build. Tasha was in her office one afternoon when her assistant walked in, a brief look of excitement on her face. "Judge, there's someone here to see you," she said. Stepping aside to let in a woman Tasha recognized immediately, a local activist who had been a staunch advocate for police reform from the very beginning. "Judge Morgan," the woman said, her voice firm but with a clear note of appreciation. "I wanted to personally thank you for everything you've done. We've been watching the department closely, and I know it's not perfect, but the difference is noticeable. The trainings, the policies, it's having an effect. It's not perfect, but it's better." Tasha stood up, meeting the activist's gaze. "I've been working with the department, yes, but it's the community that has made this possible. Your voices, your efforts, those are the ones that have made the change. It's a long road, but we're walking it together." The activist smiled, nodding. "That's exactly it. We can't rely on anyone else to fix this for us. We have to keep fighting, keep pushing, keep showing up. But with people like you involved, I actually believe we can do it." Tasha felt a rush of pride and gratitude. It wasn't just about changing the police department anymore. It was about changing the community's mindset. About showing people that they didn't have to settle for a system that treated them as second-class citizens. They could demand better. They could hold everyone accountable, from the officers to the city leaders. And it was working. Little by little, things were changing. As the conversation continued, Tasha felt the weight of the work ahead, but for the first time, it didn't feel insurmountable. The road was long, but it was a road worth walking. She was no longer fighting alone. She had a community behind her, a city that was beginning to believe in the possibility of change. The following year brought more signs of change, albeit slow and imperfect. The police department continued with its reform efforts, and while some officers still resisted, there was a noticeable shift in the way community relations were handled. The new recruits who had gone through the training were more mindful, more considerate, and it showed in their interactions with citizens. But Tasha knew that change was not always linear. There would be setbacks, there would be mistakes, but there would also be moments of triumph, small victories that would eventually add up to something greater. As the years went by, Tasha continued to work at the intersection of law and social justice. She kept fighting not just in the courtroom, but outside of it, speaking at rallies, working with community leaders, and advocating for policies that would hold police accountable. She knew that as a judge, her role was not just to preside over cases, but to be a voice for those whose voices had been silenced for far too long. Her phone buzzed one morning as she sat at her desk, reviewing new legal briefs. It was a message from Officer Wells. "Judge, I wanted to tell you something. I'm getting promoted, and I want you to know your influence has been a big part of that. I've been working harder, and I've been trying to be a better officer, a better person. Thanks for helping me see things differently." Tasha smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride. "It's not about me, Wells. It's about you and the work you've done. Keep pushing forward. Keep being better." And that was the message she wanted to send to the world. Change was possible, and it started with each individual decision. Every officer who decided to do better, every community member who stood up and demanded change, every conversation that began with understanding and empathy. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was one that could grow. and as long as people like Tasha kept fighting, it would. Years passed, and Tasha's reputation grew, not just as a judge, but as a tireless advocate for justice. Her work had become synonymous with accountability and change. People in the community began to look to her not just for legal rulings, but for guidance on how to create a system that was fair and just for everyone. The police department, though still imperfect, had come a long way since that fateful encounter between Tasha and Officer Wells. One afternoon, as Tasha sat on a panel discussing police reform with several other community leaders, she looked out at the crowd before her. The room was filled with people who, like her, were dedicated to creating a better world. They had made progress, but the fight wasn't over, it never would be. But Tasha felt a deep sense of peace. She had seen what could happen when people came together, when they refused to accept the status quo and fought for something better. She had seen the ripple effect of her actions, and the actions of those around her. They had proven time and time again that change was possible. As she spoke to the crowd, she remembered that first day when she had confronted Officer Wells. That one moment of discomfort had turned into something far more powerful. It had sparked a movement. And though it was a slow, steady fight, Tasha knew that they were winning. One conversation, one person, one step at a time. She smiled as she spoke, knowing that the fight would continue, but she was no longer alone in it. And that in itself was a victory.